I guess we're going to begin now-ish, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to talk about alternatives to the current police system and what we see as the problem and what we see as possible solutions. And I guess I'm going to go first.
Yeah, if you're up for that.
Yeah, totally. And obviously, as the more libertarian, I guess, for lack of a better word, amongst us, I took a more different approach than you might have. And I definitely support and advocate more of a voluntary free market private solution.
Yes.
And one example that I looked up that is really cool is the Detroit Threat Management. Their current private security system in place right now in Detroit. And because
right now,
yeah. And they've been happening for like, I forget how long they've been around for, but definitely a few years. And because Detroit's police system is like very undependable, most people don't feel safe from the police in general, but especially not in Detroit. They have a long history of corruption and abuse. And well, you know, in any normal rational situation, I would hope that you'd be able to fire anyone who works for you in that situation. In this case, you can't fire the public police, but there are these essentially private police you can hire. And one of the services they are most known for is escorting people onto property. So if people need to get into their business, or maybe they're locking up for the night and they're leaving their business and going to their car, that's when like a lot of muggings happen. And so the cost is $10 to be escorted from your business to your car or whatever. So it's relatively affordable, and lots of businesses have kind of jumped on this as an imperfect solution to the crime problem in Detroit. And what I really like about it is that it could be argued that these people aren't really providing the service, or they're not providing enough value to justify what they're being charged or what they're charging. And I think if that's the case, then people just won't hire them. And that's just fundamentally the huge benefit of voluntary or private police over government police, is that I think fundamentally the choice is you can either have police you pay for directly, or you have police that don't work for you.
Yeah.
I think people...
paychecks come with accountability, right?
Yeah, and I think people tend to try to think that the police currently work for us, but ultimately they do work for the state and whoever's paying their paycheck and whoever ultimately has the power to fire them. And with police unions and whatnot today, that's a very difficult thing to unravel. Like, who is really their boss if it's so difficult to fire them?
Yeah.
And something like my main general thrust of it is that I think making things voluntary, and obviously there's the free rider problem, so that if a community comes together and they hire some police, there are people within that community who might not choose to hire those police or pay for that. Yeah. And I think that is the big downside of my solution. But I think in many of these problems, there are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs. And I think in this case, the trade-off of actually having police that are accountable to you is the benefit that goes along with the downside of free rider.
So a question, and I don't mean this facetiously, I'm genuinely curious, because this is one of my holdups on moving to a solution like that. Like how, or is there even a code, like a formalized code of laws that we agree on, or is each private firm enforcing the law their own way and kind of deciding what the rules are for themselves?
Well, yeah, in the current system, it's more the first way you're describing, where every firm subscribes to their own kind of...
Current system being like this Detroit thing that's going on.
Yeah, they subscribe to an overarching standard where they actually employ bodyguard tactics, and so they're not really...
Yeah, they're not doing enforcement, they're just doing like protection.
Yeah, they protect people, ultimately. They protect people from theft, assault, and rape is like their main kind of what they focus on. But in my ideal system, yes, they would be a completely independent institution that would be enforcing private laws and ultimately enforcing different standards, because there's no perfect standard. So like maybe one community might have their local standard of, we don't allow, pot to be smoked in our like gated community. And there might be private police that enforce that private standard in that private area, but that wouldn't be like a objective standard.
Okay. So like really there isn't like, I guess like every police Like you're really just breaking it up into very small modules that are self-determining.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the worry might be, not to put words in your mouth, but I guess lots of people are concerned that there might be independent police forces that say they get hired by a corporation and they're serving that corporation. They might be hired to do some awful things. They might go to war with a different corporation.
Yeah.
And I think, especially in our current political climate, just because there's such a financial cost to aggression, I think institutions that were inappropriately aggressive would get weeded out by by the majority of people who are tending towards the non-aggression principle.
The historical example I would bring to bear here, and obviously, like in giving this example, I know your first objection is going to be that obviously there was a lot of government involvement, but I think the closest historical example we have to enforcement by private police was colonialism. Like you had companies like British East India Company, like the Dutch East India Company, like the Rupert's Land colonies and stuff like that. Like we have these corporations that came to the New World and essentially like ran a society themselves and enforced their own rules. And there was like inarguably a lot of abuse, and particularly like taking advantage of marginalized and small communities within those areas. And I just worry that you're going to inevitably, when money is what drives the decisions, you're going to have some people who have disproportionate influence, and you lose this theoretical, and I'm not going to say that the current system has this, but there's a theoretical democracy of like rich people and poor people are getting the same amount of influence into how the police are run. And I think you start to lose that, and you open yourselves up to the idea that the Hershey company owns so much of this town that they get to decide how the police work.
Yeah, I guess what I would say to that is, especially traditionally in the point in history that you're describing, I think there were social precedents that were much more accommodating of the abuse of these people. And I think fundamentally that's the core safeguard against this type of abuse, is we need to promote a culture that defends human rights in all of its forms, even for people who are dispossessed and vulnerable. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree that that is a problem of any system, whether it be if you have a police service that's run by the government or privately run. You need to have a commonly held value for human life and self-governance and human autonomy and all these things. And if we don't have that, then, and so I just think if there's going to be a majority of people who do have those values, then if there's a minority of people who go against that and try to like use their power and influence to steamroller people, I guess that's what I see as a solution, is a culture of human rights.
Wow. Okay.
That might sound a little bit.
To acknowledge that's a little bit of a cop out.
I know, and people often say that's a cop out, but honestly, I don't think that there's any way around that, because I don't think that I don't think the government solution really adds anything, because if you don't have a culture of human rights, then that power structure is going to be used to oppress people, whoever they can get away with oppressing. So I think fundamentally that's the only safeguard I see, and that's why I think promoting that culture and
I guess like the system I argue for, like I'm more of a constitutionalist, I think, than you. Like, I'm a believer in like, let's all like, and I say that in like the broadest sense. Like, do you know what the Code of Hammurabi is?
Isn't it like a very early form?
So yeah, so basically like in the days of the Babylonian Empire, they literally put like a pillar in the center of town, and they're like, these are like the laws of our society. There's nothing beyond this and nothing outside of this, and we all sort of agree that these are like the right ways. And it was like right there in the open, everyone walked past it every day, and the expectation was like you knew these rules and followed it.
Mm-hmm.
And like that's kind of like the idea I like a very bare minimum of government and like a guarantee against tyranny, but still like, you know, you got to make the trains run on time and stuff like that, right? Like
yeah.
And so I guess that would be the counter argument to me, is that like, I think you can have some small amount of government that's there to protect against something else, like protect against a company becoming like an authoritarian regime in an area, which I think historically happens a lot and still today happens a lot. Like you see modern day towns and cities in the United States that are so beholden to certain corporate interests that they can't escape them. Like the auto industry is like that, that even though these communities are being polluted by this industry, it provides jobs there, and they vote like they continue to accommodate these companies even though they're actively destroying the area.
Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, I love that idea. I didn't know that the Code of Hammurabi was so prominently displayed as you walk
Yeah,
past it
like
in the
it's literally
square.
like a pillar in town square.
That's
Like,
awesome. That's totally
yeah,
how it should be. So that, as you say, the laws are very kind of, known, and they're very
accessible.
basic,
Yeah.
accessible. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And so I think the core difference between our perspectives would be that you believe that if we have an established power structure that is very limited in its scope by
Yeah.
the Constitution, it can establish certain basic human rights for people within which we
Yeah.
can have better guarantees. But of course, this system of yours would come with some small degree of coercive taxation to
Impose them.
fund
Yeah.
these basic legal and police structures. And I guess my take would be that while that is vastly superior to what we have currently, and I would have a very
Yeah.
small issue with it, my very small issue with it would be uh, I think that that small breach of human rights, saying that people are forced to pay that to fund this system,
Yeah.
I find that it's kind of like a small little wedge into the logic of human rights
Absolutely.
that you can be wedged out and widened. Whereas my alternative is I believe that we can have emergent power structures, and the emergent power structures that serve the people the best and promote the most wealth creation and
Yeah.
human cooperation will be the ones that people grow to and gravitate towards, and those grow. Whereas the ones that are kind of predatory and self-destructive and kind of just like crazy cults that don't really function properly, they're going to get outcompeted in an actual emergent competitive environment. And through that process, we'll eventually arrive at there will be a dominant structure in the area, but it won't be coercive, and it won't be kind of top-down dictated. It's going to be an emergent structure that, same thing, it could be a city-state with a code of Hammurabi in its town square, but
Sure.
it'd be the kind of thing where presumably if someone wanted to be like, I don't really feel like buying into this, I'm going to just like live within these walls, but like non-aggressively coexist amongst your society, I would think that would be okay, even though it does leave us open to the free rider problem and things like that.
For sure. And I do want to acknowledge, like, historically, the wedge thing you're describing is exactly what happened. Like when we made America or the French Revolution or any of these states, it starts at very small minimum of government and it balloons out of control over time. But I think there is, like, I guess the one thing that stops me from calling myself a libertarian is I struggle to say that you really have a right that isn't in some way like guaranteed or enshrined. Like it's very easy to say everyone has like the right to free engagement and like to make contracts with people and to enter into any consenting agreement they want. But if there isn't something there to stop people from impeding that right, I struggle with in what sense it is a right. Like, and I look at like an example would be like fair employment. Like in a lot of places, like on paper, we said these people have this right to like be treated the same as other people of different races or genders or whatever. But if the practical result is that they are still being systemically oppressed and not being given that right in the actual society, do they really have that? Or is it just like wishful thinking, I guess? Like if the practical reality of my life is that I have to submit to a corporation in order to enjoy my freedom, am I really free? As opposed to like, and I agree that there's like a paradox there that obviously you're giving away freedom to government in order to get it back. You're sort of borrowing its watch to tell them the time. But I do think there needs to be some sort of backed guarantee, or else it's just anarchy ultimately. Like,
Uh, yeah, I think one of the things that's implicit in what you're saying is that we need some sort of established institution to defend human rights. And I think fundamentally, regardless of whether it's government or a market-based legal structure or whatever,
for sure.
fundamentally what's going to defend human rights is people who believe in this culture of human rights willing to stand up and use violence to push back against
sure.
the encroachment. And I think, and that ultimately happens regardless of whether or not there's a overarching governing structure at all. And I do think with regards to corporations, I'm not sure, I forget the word you used, but I'm not sure how you're necessarily beholden to them in that situation, unless perhaps they're a security company that's employed by you to protect you. Maybe maybe depend on their bigger size to defend you in this context, and so you must pay them.
So like the idea is like essentially, and if I'm wrong on this, like cut me off, feel free to cut me off. But like essentially the argument is that we're moving to a democracy where we vote with money rather than we vote with like personal influence. Like the idea is that like corporations that receive the most money for their services will be selected for, and corporations that people don't want to purchase from. And in this sense, a corporation could be a private security firm or the one several layers up that's ultimately paying the security firm,
Mm-hmm.
or what have you. But in a lot of industries and towns and areas, like corporations just have such a disproportionate amount of financial influence that they can drown out those other voices. And you get like, do you know what a local minima is, or a local maxima in mathematics? So the idea is like you can have a graph, like a cubic graph that'll go like this, right? So it'll like go up and then it'll dip back down and then it'll continue off towards like utopia or what have you. And if people are in the peak right here, then any movement away from that is downwards.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get stuck there where you can't actually, so even though like the actual off to infinity is way up over here, perhaps you can't stomach, or you struggle to stomach the dip that it would take to get you there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a lot of cases, corporations take advantage of this. Like if you look at, well, basically any industry, they're built on this, where you find a maxima and they say, okay, like if you quit your job and go pursue your own business, you're going to have to take a dip. If you like don't want to work at the grocery store anymore and you want to open a restaurant, like your life's going to get way shittier for a little while and then it might continue up. But a lot of people are in a position where they can't do that. So they get stuck here. And then, yeah. So like, that's kind of, I kind of forgot my train of thought there, but.
I guess in response to the first thing you're saying with it being a system where people vote with their dollars,
Yes.
By and large, that would be the system. There would also be
Yes.
alternative ways of organizing where you could just have, like lots of poor communities in the past, if they didn't have access to police, they would just organize local militias, community.
Posse police, yeah.
Yeah, and I know San Francisco had during the gold rush, they didn't have any police in the late 18th, 19th century or 19th century.
Yeah, like the sheriff system, right? You have like a sheriff who can rally a posse or a militia or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I don't even think they had sheriffs. They just had, or maybe they did, but they had local militias that were emergent that would essentially try to police their local neighborhoods. And so I think you can have voting with your dollars, but you can also have community militias. And I do agree that lots of big corporations, they kind of position themselves where to not depend on them is to take a short-term hit, for sure. And I think that absolutely is an issue. I'm just not sure what the superior option would be to.
The theoretical argument, whether you agree with it or not, is that government is capable of correcting these graphs and making it better. So if you have something like a universal basic income, for example, and I don't want to get into that, but it's just an example of like something like that diminishes the depth of that trough and makes it easier for people to traverse to the better end of the graph.
there's more social mobility and just
Yeah,
general
like
financial mobility.
improving mobility, putting a floor on things and stuff like that. Like that would be the traditional argument. Same with something like unemployment. Like that's exactly what they're saying. Is like you should be able to find work without dying of starvation.
Yeah, and I think generally, I think there's a lot of good that can come from creating the opportunities and creating safety nets in society.
Absolutely.
But I do think there is, from the other side of things, there is a danger in creating the conditions where people don't struggle and in turn develop the skills that they need
Yeah,
to.
like moral hazard kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's why I personally believe that these types of charities and social safety nets should be implemented on more the individual level, so people can have the insight to know if, oh, this person truly needs my help.
Yeah,
They are down and out in their luck, they're trying hard, or this person has an attitude where they think that
yeah.
this is owed to them and they're never going to grow as a person. If
I think a lot of libertarians are attracted to the idea, and I am attracted to it as well, of like, if I'm going to donate to charity, I want to kind of decide where that money is going. Like,
Yeah,
government tends to be like flat, equal across the board, whereas a lot of people are attracted to the idea of like, I don't want to give it to some free rider welfare leech. I want to pick somebody that I feel has promise and opportunity. Like it's more of an investment in your society, I guess.
yeah, and there's lots of like really cool programs out there like that. Like I know the Fig
Mm-hmm.
Tree Foundation, they literally connect first world investors with individuals in the third world who are trying to create like small economy or try to small businesses or like build a
Yeah,
well or build a generator. And it's not even a charity, it's an investment. I've given to this company before where you invest like $100 or $200 into a small project and then it's paid back to you. And it's an amazing little system. And that's the kind of thing that in terms of solving poverty that appeals to me. But the idea of um, even just giving to a blanket charity, I think oftentimes is it's just not
yeah,
as surgical of a solution. I think the nature of this problem requires a surgical solution.
for sure. Although what I would impress upon you is that in that system, what you're going to see is that marginalized people receive less resources because they're seen, fairly or unfairly, they're seen as less attractive to, as like, if you look at it that way, people aren't going to invest in like unlikable people because that's just human nature, right? And people who are like, a lot of people like that would say, I'm not going to give my money to like a homeless drug addict
Yeah.
because they're just going to waste it. But like realistically, the homeless drug addict needs more help than the people you would be interested in giving it to, because we're going to be attracted to giving money to people who are just like one rung below surviving, because say, hey, if I give this guy $1,000 and he makes this one car payment, it's going to change his life.
Yeah, no, at the risk of bringing a whole other issue of autonomy into this, I do think that in that case, it could be very useful to give to an organization that maybe tried to give him care and assistance, because in that case, maybe someone is like addicted or having mental issues around schizophrenia or whatever, such that they can't make the decisions that would benefit themselves rationally. And I think in that case, there are extreme cases where a third party can intervene and make decisions on behalf of that person. And
I think I don't even think it's a problem, but a consequence of a libertarian ideology is that people who freely choose terrible things for themselves suffer in that society.
Yeah, and that's why I think I'm open to gray area where, like, personally, if I lived in a community with people, like a purely free market libertarian community, and there was an individual who had, an intense case of just maybe they were schizophrenic and they needed to take a certain medication to not be violent to themselves and others. And there are very peaceful schizophrenics, so this is not that. But if they were a violent individual and they needed to take those meds, I see rationale, I see logic in trying to make that happen. If that comes to forcing them to take drugs, ultimately that's something that I have to support. And that's kind of a very interesting ethical gray area that I still struggle with, but that is a kind of consideration that I try to balance with my generally libertarian outlook.
I think that like fuzzy issues of consent are like one of the Hilbert problems for the 21st century. Like we see a lot of them. Like
absolutely.
And they're very difficult for us to engage with as a society because we're so used to taking like an all or nothing approach. And it's really hard, like just the way our society is built, to like not take an all or nothing approach to consent and say like, sometimes people don't get to make that decision for themselves and stuff like that. Or sometimes people aren't ready or aren't equipped to make that decision for themselves. If someone has very poor education, can they really make like an educated decision on anything? Like,
Yeah, and I probably will go pretty far in the extreme as well, right? I really, want people to have the right to make bad decisions ultimately.
absolutely.
So I think I would push it further to the extreme than the average person, but I think
Absolutely.
there
I
needs to
think
be
I
a
would as
line.
well. Like,
Like,
I tend to, even in the extreme corner cases, I'm like, if you're like under the influence of a substance, like that's still a decision you made to put yourself in that position. Like if you're
yeah,
like, I do think like age restrictions, I'm not a big proponent of. Like we've talked before about how I don't really like the idea of, oh, like you just turned 18, now you're ready to make all these decisions that you were completely legally incapable of making yesterday. Like,
well, I think what we landed on is, well, there is some rationale and logic behind
yeah,
some sort of a vague age restriction. The idea of making it explicit at 18 or whatever doesn't seem to make a
exactly,
lot of sense, whereas it would make more sense to tie it to the capacity to understand the
for sure.
consequences of your actions and whatever else.
There's an ironic like equality in arbitrary decisions that people are attracted to. I think that like if you
Yeah,
made it a test or something, people would question the test all the time, whereas nobody questions like just put a number there and fucking stick to it. Like,
yeah. No,
for
and I
anything.
think, part of it is healthy that we need these equal, general,
Yeah,
standardized things for like laws. Like laws require a certain degree of standardization,
for sure.
and that's what draws us to these kind of simple answers around consent and or
Yeah, or anything.
necessity. Absolutely. So I
Yeah.
think it's not an easy solution for that reason. Is that we're always pulled to these bold, overarching answers. But
Okay. I'm going to tie it back to police because
cool.
I have a big point that I think is kind of where circling around that I want to
Yeah.
get into because I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. So a big part of my identification of the problem and my solution for the policing issues is that I think historically a lot of what police do now is really managing externalities of dangerous products that like corporations are not being held account to. So I'll use the three examples that I want to use are alcohol, tobacco, and vehicles, because these are three examples where the police spend like an inordinate amount of resources managing these issues, and really like they are corporate issues. Like if a company is making a product that causes people to be dangerous and damages society and things like that, they should be responsible to bear the value of that cost. Like, and our current system doesn't hold them to account. And I feel that your system holds them even less to account because they're going to be a major player in the police, perhaps even more so than they are now. So like my ideal thing would be like, if you're going to be a company that creates cars, for example, like, and for cars to function in society safely, we need stoplights, we need speed traps, we need speed limits, we need training courses, we need a certification program, we need all of these things to make it like palatable and acceptable for our society. Then the state should not be fronting any of those costs. Those are built-in costs of your product, and you should be responsible for doing those things. And if you can't responsibly deliver a product, then you shouldn't be able to sell it. Like if you can't handle those things. And in a lot of cases of police abuse, in my opinion, you deal with like traffic faults. Like a lot of these beatings and
Yeah.
shootings and things like that start with
Traffic
someone gets
stops.
pulled over for
Yeah.
speeding or parking tickets or things like that. And it's very rarely like this guy is like, very rarely does this happen in the context of like a theft or a murder or something like that. It's always a minor property crime that is really the onus of an automobile company or a company that makes guns. Like if you make guns, then, and for guns to be a safe part of society, we need certification and regulation and all these things. The company selling guns should be required to do that.
Yeah. I think
Yeah, sorry. Go
it's
ahead.
okay. No, it's good. I think if the case can be made that a certain negative externality is an inherent part or an inherent effect from a certain product, then I
Yeah.
think the case can be made that they are required, obligated to pay the cost of that negative externality. I do think in the case of cars, at least, I'm not sure that things like even speed limits or stop signs or any of these things are necessary or an inherent extension of
For
that,
sure.
because there are lots of uh, there's lots of research that's shown that even cars that, or if you stoplights, sorry, there's
Yeah.
lots of research that shows that stoplights and things like that actually increase traffic accidents.
Absolutely.
And I think
Uncontrolled intersections are the safest intersections in our society.
yeah, and I think if you have a, yeah, personally, my take would be that if you owned a road, because in my ideal society, all roads would be privately
Roads
owned.
are another example of like, why doesn't a car company, if you need roads, no one would say that I'm going to turn the train on and you better build the track at the other end or it's going to crash. Like, but roads somehow get offloaded from an automobile company onto the public.
Yeah, well, I think that's ultimately how it should be. Like, if I want a road out in front of my house, that's ultimately my responsibility to create that. Or if I want a road to connect my business to a community, that's ultimately my responsibility as a business owner or the people funding the business to do that. I don't think that it is a car company's responsibility to ensure that their cars can be driven everywhere. Nor do I think that it should be their responsibility if somebody using their car crashes or does something else negligent. I think,
I
yeah,
guess I agree with that, but I would argue that a road is part of, like, the car company should be delivering a full product. And if a road is required for a car to be used safely, like if we could talk about the idea of why do you have to drive on a road? Why can't you drive on a sidewalk or through a park or any of that? Like, we've decided roads are necessary for cars to be a functional part of our society. And if they are, then why isn't the corporation required to deliver that full solution?
well, I think in many areas of our economy, uh, one product might exist in isolation, and it might depend on, like, you might buy a pencil. To use
Yeah,
that pencil, you're required to write on something like a notebook or anything else.
for
So
sure.
does that pencil company, are they required to provide the notebooks or pay for the notebooks as well? Or
But
lots of things exist in isolation, and they come together
absolutely,
through economic interaction.
absolutely. And I'm not like, cars are not the hill that I'm going to die on. But like, I would say the difference there is that roads make cars a safer and less like, roads are necessary to make cars a safe and undestructive part of our society. Like, they are managing a negative effect rather than enhancing the use of your car. And you could argue in certain circumstances they don't necessarily do that. Like, we do have dirt roads and people do just like do off-roading and things like that. But if you're going to say, like, if we don't build roads here, people are going to drive through your front yard and this nice park we built in New York and things like that. Like, if they're managing a negative effect, companies are responsible to manage the negative externalities of their product.
Yeah, well, I don't think that if we did live in a society where people were they weren't inclined to build roads, I don't think that that would mean that therefore people have the right to drive through public parks and drive through your front yard or whatever. I think people have, if you buy a car, you have the personal responsibility still of not trespassing and aggressing on
For
other people's
sure.
land. And
Maybe those are extreme examples, but like, to not drive in the sidewalk, maybe we require like a denoted, like, this is the only place your car is allowed to be type of thing.
yeah, well, I think lots of, because I believe in private roads,
Yeah,
that standard would emerge it would emerge from that. Like, people wouldn't
yeah,
want you to drive on their private sidewalk or lawn or whatever.
for
I do
sure.
think, with regards to your point of roads are something that allow cars to be driven more safely, I do think we can probably find innumerable other examples where there are certain products that you can buy other products to go with them to allow things to be a little bit easier or done more safely. Like, you can buy lots of outdoor equipment, and like I could go camping this weekend. Something I should probably bring with me is bear spray, but I might not necessarily bring bear spray with me, even though it's like something that can go with along with the rest of my camping gear to make the whole experience safer, I think. And
Absolutely.
you can find just so many examples of, I think, there are products sold in isolation that may be
For sure.
unsafe. So I'm not
And I,
much.
I realize that I'm preaching to the choir when I say like it should not be the government's job to enforce those types of things.
Cool. Okay.
Because we as a society agree that bear spray isn't something that needs to be necessitated with like monopoly of force. But for whatever reason, as a society, we have agreed that speeding is something that needs to be like enforced, and roads are something that needs to be enforced. These extra services that come along with driving, we've agreed are essential. And
Yeah.
if they are an essential part of that experience, then I think that is a cost that should be attached to the product. It needs to be part of the negotiation that happens with it, or else you're going to have a breakdown and you're going to have externalities. When a company is selling you a car, they have to say, you're also responsible to pay for all this extra shit, and it's going to cost you more, and you should factor that in when you're buying a car, rather than saying, oh, we're just going to sell you a cheap car and everything else is just going to come from a third party that's not part of this negotiation.
Yeah, no, I definitely, well, because I believe that roads shouldn't be a product of a group decision as a society. I don't think we should come together.
For sure.
So that example doesn't necessarily speak to me, but
Yeah.
I still definitely think that a company has the right to say, we're going to sell you this one little product. Now, this one little product in isolation isn't very useful, but if you go purchase, the right to drive on this road from this corporation, or you purchase whatever, or you,
for sure.
I don't know. I'm not sure what the.
I get what you're saying. It really is the difference between whether you see them as essential pieces or not. Like,
I do.
You think that we could have a society where everyone's driving around without all these extra services, and maybe you do, and that's fine. But like, I think we could say generally people think at least some of these enforcement measures are necessary in order to make driving safe. Like, I think we would say that driving with no speed limits, no rules, no law enforcement would be like so dangerous that we shouldn't accept it as a society.
Well, I think that it's not that there should be no rules, but the rules should be a negotiation process between the people who own the roads and the people who might be potential customers of those road owners. So, like, if people want to drive on roads that have speed limits, then people who build roads are going to put in place speed limits that are kind of like catering to the general average demand. And then these laws and standards will be an emergent thing. I don't think that they necessarily have to be mandated.
The car company needs to be part of that negotiation and be like,
no, not at all. I think you said, I think you used the word essential, if roads are an essential part of the whole process. But once again, I think like you can buy a computer. I bought my computer and then I bought my monitor separately several months later from a different retailer, different producer, different manufacturer. And there was no issue with that. I see no issue with very different companies selling you things that need each other, are essential. And I'm not sure what the contradiction is there.
Surely we can, while still perhaps disagreeing, we can acknowledge there's a difference between a piece of a product that enhances it versus a piece that makes it less dangerous or destructive. Especially, like, the big thing in driving as well is that it isn't just you in the car, it's also the potential damage to like people around you that aren't part of any of these discussions. Like,
yeah, I mean,
you run down a pedestrian, they weren't part of any of the negotiations you've had with these people.
Absolutely. And I do think that, you should be responsible if you run down a pedestrian, but I don't see the logic in, for instance, why a car company should be responsible if you run down a pedestrian, or if they were responsible for not building the road and that caused you to be like, okay, well, I'm just going to drive on this sidewalk and run down this old lady. I think those are very unrelated.
But if you have a product that is consistently causing a problem to people, like, at some point you have to look at the creator of that product. I think, like, it's very easy for them to offload all the responsibility onto you as a consumer, but at some point, like, it's the creation of the device itself is a root cause of the problem. Like, if I make a product that kills innocent people all the time, like, maybe once or twice I can say, wow, like, the operator is at fault. But if it's a consistent issue and an average person, or a person with the amount of training I think is necessary, is failing to use a product safely, I think the corporation has to bear some of that cost. Like, it is result of their work on the product. Not like, I don't think all damage done by a product is the result of the end user, I guess would be my claim. And maybe you just fundamentally disagree with that.
Well, I agree with the last statement you made in that it's not all the responsibility of the end user. However, I don't have the number offhand because I didn't prepare for this particular conversation, but I know the number of auto deaths annually is no small number. Do you think that car companies, because right now car companies are not responsible financially or legally for those deaths, do you think they should be held responsible?
I do. So what I would propose to you is that what car companies have essentially done in our society is that they've established a fundamentally unrealistic standard of use. Is that they've said, if you use our vehicle in this unachievable, perfect way, it is safe. If you are never on your phone, you never have a drink before you get in, you never get sleepy in your car, if you never do any of these things, it's perfectly safe. But that's an unachievable standard. But by setting that standard, they offload all the responsibility onto the user, which is when we have car accidents, it's always, like the guy behind the wheel, it's his fault. One of the drivers is at fault, whereas perhaps vehicles just come with an inherent amount of danger that we accept because we like to us as a society, the benefits of driving outweigh 36,000 deaths a year or whatever the number is. But I would argue that if you have to use a product perfectly in order for it to be safe, that it isn't actually safe.
Yeah, I agree.
That ultimately, I do think that vehicle manufacturers, without saying that I think cars should be like illegal or anything because they're unsafe, I think vehicle manufacturers are responsible for the product, like the damage done by the product. Like if it causes X number of dollars of damage, however you want to assign value to deaths and accidents and things like that, I think to a certain extent, that is a externality of their product and they should be fronting that cost.
Yeah, and I think the end result of what you're describing, it sounds to me like what it would be is the car companies would determine that there's a fixed amount of cost inherent in the companies in the product they're selling.
Yeah.
And so they're going to tack that onto the cost of the vehicle. And then, so the consumer is just going to be purchasing slightly more expensive vehicles. And the alternative would be that instead of purchasing that, like the cost of the risk or the cost of the damage to others up front in the vehicle, the alternative is my system is they would pay for that when they actually do the damage, if they are actually individually responsible. So in your system, the cost would be diffused amongst all people who buy a car. And in my system, the cost would be localized to the individuals who actually commit the accident. And I guess as well, you seem to be saying that the responsibility, I guess the way I see it is the responsibility for the fatalities and all the damage. It shifts from the car company to the consumer as long as there is informed consent, as long as the consumer knows what they're buying when they buy the car and they understand the damage it can do to others, then they accept this risk and that would be applied to everyone else.
I would say there's like a distributed responsibility there. Like I do, like certainly I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying that like someone who crashes into the front of your store is in no way at fault, because they are to some extent. Although you can have an accident, like if somebody has a seizure while they're driving and crashes into somebody, that's not really their fault. And if we were to assign responsibility for that to anyone, I would have to say it resides with the car company or whoever's letting them drive this vehicle without it being safe. Like it's hard for me to say that somebody having an accident because of a freak medical issue that they might not have known about is their fault.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't think it's, I don't like the idea of assigning blame in that instance. I just don't think that it would necessarily be any more reasonable to assign blame to the car company. But I see what you're saying.
But the car company, like, okay, let me give you like, let's move to guns because they're a more extreme example, and extreme examples are fun. So if I, as a gun manufacturer, sell a gun to a 12-year-old, on some level, I am responsible for what they've done because I'm selling a gun to somebody who cannot use it properly. And I know that, and I do it anyway.
And I think that kind of relates to what I was saying about if you have informed consent about the risk. And I'm not sure a 12-year-old, same with cars, I'm not sure a 12-year-old, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe the line can be drawn there. I'm not sure they have the capacity to safely use one of these products. And so I think if someone were to sell a car or a gun to a 12-year-old, they have not offloaded the risk because there was not the kind of conformed consent that you can have with an adult.
Is there a direct correlation between informed consent and ability to use a product safely? Like, could there not be a situation where someone is giving willing and informed consent, but you as the manufacturer can still assess and say this person is not going to safely use this product? Like, let's say with the example of guns, let's say somebody is a criminal, for example. They're still freely and consentingly buying that gun, but if you know that they're going to use it to shoot somebody, is there not some onus on you to not sell that to them? And if you put a loaded gun in their hand, quite literally, like, don't you bear some onus for the results of that?
Yeah, well, certainly if you know that they have an intent to commit a crime, then I think you could be considered an accomplice to what's happening. I think maybe we can consider like a squirrel suit, those like skydiving suits that people buy, where it's like, those are incredibly dangerous. And as a seller of those, I might know how many people die wearing those. But as long as the individual buying it understands, and maybe that's different because it only hurts themselves and not others.
Yeah, that's what I was going
to say.
I want to say, like, I'm fully in favor of people are allowed to absorb risk for themselves.
Okay.
The key issue I see here is that there's another actor that isn't part of this negotiation that is bearing some of the risk.
Yeah.
And in some ways that is like a moral hazard. Like, you're not absorbing all of the risk financially of the decision you're making. And so you're going to make more risky decisions because some of that risk is offloaded onto people who don't have to be financially compensated by the parties involved.
But I do think what you're saying might actually be stronger for my case, because in my system, the individual who crashes the car into a pedestrian would be primarily and fundamentally responsible. Whereas it sounds like in your system, it would be more so the person who buys the car would diffuse the risk or diffuse the consequences across all people who buy cars away from the individual who crashes into the pedestrian. So I do think
yeah, I see what you're saying. So like in offloading that on, like, I agree, like if you make the company pay for it, it's ultimately goes to consumers. It's not coming out of some guy's piggy bank. Like,
especially if it's a law across the board where all the companies have to absorb the risk in an equal amount. Yeah,
for sure. I think like you'd have to actually do some math to see which one of those is going to be like worse. Like, obviously the idea of distributing cost that way versus the distribution of costs to like we're still distributing it to all of society ultimately, because like you're paying with your 0.2% chance that you're going to get killed by a car. Or whatever. I'm not sure what the percentage would be.
Sure,
but
yeah.
There's still a distributed cost there, and you'd have to do like an actual analysis to see which one of those is more likely. But it is a valid point that certainly.
Yeah. I do think like these could be two different strategies of how to absorb cost. I mean, I'm not. I guess all I would say is I would prefer that if your system was implemented, it would be on an emergent basis, like a city-state collectively agreed that they were going to only allow car companies to operate within those areas or sell company cars within those areas if they did absorb a certain amount of the cost. So that it could be a thing that emerges in, I don't know.
Yeah, I think like I have less faith in the free market than you do. Like, I'm big into correcting injustices in the free market. Like, and I think like when you see an externality, and I believe like we both agree that is an externality, like nobody's really paying that cost right now, or the government is paying the cost ultimately.
Of what, sorry? Of like, of individuals?
Of like automobile costs. So like if like all these safety measures we put in place to make cars safer, the government is fronting that cost. So like every cop, every speeding ticket, every red light, every stop sign, that's all being fronted by the government in order to make driving safe. And
yeah.
If my argument would be that if companies were forced to be responsible for the safety of their product, like potentially it would just raise the price of the car. But what we would hope would happen is that these structures that make cars more safe would be provided by the corporation so that their product is better and that it doesn't hurt people.
Yeah,
Because currently there's no incentive for them to do it at all because they
yeah.
don't bear any of that risk in the current bargain.
And you're saying that their focus might shift towards prevention rather than, rather than
Yeah,
not doing
currently,
that.
currently, if you asked a car company, like, is it safe to drive a car? Like, is someone gonna die from me driving this car? They would say, if you follow the speed limit, don't break the rules, don't drink, don't text, don't do all these things, and follow the laws and all that, it's safe to drive this car. And if that is what it takes to make it safe, they should be my argument would be they should be fronting the cost of that, or else we're subsidizing that risk for them by not making them cover it. Or maybe, like you say, they just say, we're going to pay every death benefit and a car costs 10 times as much. Maybe they do that, but that still has the same net effect because you're going to have less people driving and you're going to have less fatalities.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I don't think the government should be enforcing speeding laws or bearing the cost of any of these externalities. I think if anyone should be, I think the car companies should be promoting, a safe, or they should be building a safe automobile. And I think the main reason they would be doing that is because people want to buy a safe automobile. They don't want themselves and their family to die in an automobile crash. And I think, I still think that the externalities around protecting individuals on the road should fall towards the private companies that run those roads, because they're creating those conditions. Like if you create a very safe road, I think the benefits of that should accrue to the road company that creates that road. And if you create a road that people drive on and it's like a death trap, I think the consequences should accrue to the people who built that road.
But then don't you think if you built a car that is a death trap, the consequences should accrue to that corporation?
Only if there's no informed consent. So like somebody can build like a squirrel, like a, it should be noted, like maybe if you're building a car, okay, I guess it gets really weird here because we're talking about,
I agree. Like it's
only
in nature. But
we're only talking about cars that could harm other people, not themselves. So it's like if I build a car that when I get into collisions, I just destroy other cars.
So let's say like as a car company, I'm going to do like, I'm going to say, I'm going to put like a titanium frame in my car. So I just cut through every other vehicle like butter.
Yeah.
So like you and me, as the people making that deal, if I'm buying a car from you, I say, I'm getting a better deal on this car and they're going to sell more cars because it's more safe. But the car company that's making aluminum frames now is less safe. Their car has been made less safe by the introduction of my car.
And I think I just think that the responsibility falls on the consumer if they have informed consent and they buy this weapon that they're putting on the road that they're going to get behind the wheel of. I think they've accepted the responsibility through informed consent of whatever they do with that vehicle.
So would you say, like, to back you into a corner and ask like a pointed question, would you say that a pedestrian has no right to interfere in that decision, even if they bear consequences for it? That like ultimately they deal with the cars they get and maybe they're entitled to financial compensation after the fact, but they have no right to be part of that negotiation and say, I'm a stakeholder in this deal and I want a car that's safer for me as well. Or are they excluded from that and forced to deal with the consequences after the fact?
I guess I would say that I believe the way that they have an ability to avoid harm is to choose to, like, ultimately ultimately my answer to you is no. I don't think they have a right to have a say over that interaction. Like, but I do think that they have a right to like say, I'm not going to go on roads that allow these vehicles, or I'm not going to, like, if they become very well known in society for being just like horrifying machines of destruction, then there's going to be kind of lots of companies are going to exclude them from their roadways, and that's going to be a whole issue as well. And I think there are lots of financial incentives to not kind of end up in that sort of situation.
Yeah, like I guess generally part of my struggle is that I don't believe there's ever truly a deal that's only between two people. Like there are always more than two stakeholders, and the vision of like, I'm going to buy this and you and me will agree on it, it always excludes those people. Every deal, whether they're microscopic or gigantic, every negotiation has third parties and externalities attached.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always very subtle negative externalities everywhere, and
Yeah,
absolutely.
they're not always subtle.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's any EC. Yeah.
For sure. Okay. Well,
sorry, 1 second. I'm just going to close this window.
Yeah. I guess reaching that fundamental disconnect, I don't have much more to say on that topic, so I can hand it back to you. And
I mean, I guess so. For a solution for police, I guess your solution would be ultimately that we want a very stripped down code of conduct, stripped down legal system that they enforce, and that's defined by a very.
So I like the idea of like I mentioned the Code of Hammurabi and something like that. Like I don't think we need 10,000 different laws with every law having subsections and clauses and things like that. We could very basically, I think most people could define the really bad things that we really want to be protected from that are arbitrary and difficult to handle in a corporate like scenario. Like it's very difficult to say that I'm going to be protected from murder by like hired by the hour police and things like that. And especially if I'm like a poor person who has to get the crappiest version of hired by the hour police, like obviously it's tough for me. So I think we'd all, whether we agree on how they should be funded, we agree what the bad crimes are, and you can count them on one hand, like theft, rape, murder, kidnapping. It's a pretty short list. And all the little crimes, like I don't want a dog to crap on my front walk and things like that, like most of those are really externalities of corporate deals. And like these corporations are offloading enforcement costs onto the public sector rather than bearing those costs themselves. And I think that's a big part of the problem. And if we move to a system where corporations had to bear those costs themselves, and again, maybe they're using private security firms, like you say, maybe they're changing their product to improve away some of these things. Like an example I always give is that it would be very easy for a company to just make it so you couldn't drive a vehicle without your seatbelt buckled, but instead they don't, and we have cops going around making sure you're driving with a seatbelt on because they fully offloaded all of that responsibility onto the public sector. Like, and maybe there shouldn't be a seatbelt law, but if we are going to say you have to wear a seatbelt, why isn't the company responsible for doing that? Why are we as a society bearing that cost? So I think when you start to look at what role police should really have, we could have a much smaller and more targeted police force and the less sort of like Orwellian surveillance, maintaining order police that is always of these sort of corporate crimes, making sure people are using their car correctly, making sure people are drinking alcohol correctly, making sure people are responsible for their animal that they bought correctly. All of these things are actually corporate interests and don't need to be handled by the public sector.
Cool.
Yeah. I'm sure you fundamentally disagree.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I already kind of went over, I think as long as there's informed consent, that would be the point at which a consumer takes on that responsibility from the, but that's fine. We can, I mean, I think we've said all we can about that topic. What do you think about the concept of defund the police? I'm sure you then, just to throw some softballs.
So I'm enjoying defund the police because I think a lot of libertarians are sneaking into a very left-wing issue and being like, yeah, just fucking get rid of it.
Yeah.
Cut taxes, cut spending. This is great.
Yeah.
I am fully in favor. Like the police system we have now is horrible. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And I think, I disagree with the idea that it's inherently racist. It is absolutely designed to target marginalized people more than anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And every single law on the books is going to be enforced more against minorities, immigrants, like people who don't have less of a say. Like, you know, the old thing, like if you see a millionaire in a suit get pulled over by the cop, he's not getting a ticket. Like,
yeah,
and he's certainly not going to get like kneeled on until he suffocates. Like he just gets treated differently because he's more privileged in our society. And I think that's the core issue we need to address. But a big part of that is just that police are too powerful and not regulated at all, really. Like we're seeing in the US how much police really just run themselves, and even like the city government that's supposed to be in charge of them aren't able to effectively like rein them in and stop them from doing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Sweet.
Yes, I fully believe in defunding the police.
Yeah.
I do think you need a certain amount of police left, but I think it would be like, 10% or less of the police presence we have now, and it would look very different.
They'd be focusing on the tasks that you described before. And
yeah, focus on those tasks. Focus on like more of a focus. The other thing I wanted to bring up, and I brought it up before, but like the statistics will tell you the police are horrible at solving those crimes. Like the really important crimes, police are terrible at. Like less than 10% of thefts get solved in the United States nationwide, which is horrible. And when you talk to people, like there's a complete crisis of confidence where people are like, why would I even call the police? They're not going to find my stolen car. They're not going to find like the guy who broke into my apartment. And the police will straight up tell you, like, we're not even going to look into this. Like, good fucking luck.
And I think that's such an indication that those police don't work for those people.
Exactly.
Anyone who works for you, you can fire them. So it seems very... What do you think about the idea that, I know we've mentioned this before in a previous video, where at least in the United States, they deal with a bit of a unique situation where a cop is shot about once a day, and they have a lot more of an issue with cops being killed because there's such a huge gun culture in the States and such a huge culture of violence. And I think while it is an issue with cops being a little quick to the trigger sometimes, especially in the States, I think they are dealing with a bit of a unique situation where there is a huge risk when they pull someone over that they're going to get shot, because that's when it often happens.
So I guess I really struggle to sympathize. Like, I agree that's terrible. And I would never want to be a cop. It seems like the worst job in the world. They get paid dick all. They're in a horrible situation. Nobody ever sings their praises. They only get criticized. Like,
especially with victimless crimes. Yeah.
However, like, I think a lot of people deal with difficult situations in their jobs. Like, lots of nurses deal with stuff like that. Lots of private security guards deal with stuff like that. Even like retail employees and stuff like that. And you would never accept that nurses are shooting people all the time. Like, we would never as a society accept that, even though they deal with a lot of the exact same individuals, but certainly a lot of the same cross sections of society.
Yeah, and absolutely the fact that police can get away with these crimes through qualified immunity and other protections in a way that nurses can't is completely insane.
But what I really think is the deep issue is that, like, police, like, fundamentally as a cop, you don't have the right to be, like, respected. Like, certainly as a citizen, I'm required to follow the law. I don't think as a citizen I have to be nice to a cop. I don't think I have to cooperate if I'm innocent. I don't think that, like, if a cop is violating my rights, typically the standard is just let them do it and deal with it in court later. And I think that's fundamentally broken. Like, if a cop is doing something wrong, I have the right to defend myself against a wrongful arrest. I have the right to, walk away from a cop that doesn't have the, like, proper documentation to arrest me. And I think, like, what you see in a lot of these cases is that someone's mouthing off, and that's why they get killed. And I just don't think that's such an escalation that I think is unnecessary.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think just the fact that police are put into a separate legal category in lots of different ways, such that they can use violence in a way that other people can't. Most people are restricted to violence in the case of self-defense or defense of others, and cops can use violence in way more ways beyond that. And I think fundamentally an equal legal standard should be applied to all of us.
Absolutely.
Basically bringing public cops down to the level of private cops or private citizens, which is kind of what aligns with that view there.
For sure. Like, and again, bringing up the example of security guards, like, I think private security firms are highly effective and they hardly ever kill anybody. And in a lot of ways, like, they are a much more effective deterrent to things like theft and, like, vandalism and things like that than the actual police that are allowed to kill you are. So I'm not sure what value we're getting from them.
Yeah, and I think if anything, it can be argued that, assuming police actually served poor and marginalized communities, as you say, because poor and marginalized communities can't always pay for the brunt of the service,
Yeah.
they might benefit as the free rider. And so I guess it could almost be argued that assuming the police force is functioning properly and isn't just serving
Yeah.
financial interests, then they can actually, yeah.
The thing I'm very sympathetic to is that the current government solution isn't working, and like we can't just say they need another $100 million and they'll make it go away. Like that thinking really has to stop in our society. We have Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate, getting up and saying he wants to increase police funding nationwide, and it just doesn't work. You can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it in the first place.
Yeah, and well, I don't necessarily think that funding was what created it. I definitely agree that the thinking that funding is the solution is just in no way addresses the core problem.
Yeah, like police are too full of themselves and are causing too many problems. Let's have more police. Let's give them more weapons. Like, I think police have what they need to solve the problem and they aren't doing it properly. I don't think it's a resource issue.
I guess that's a nice segue into the concept of the militarization or demilitarization of police. Do you think that, or what is your take on that?
So first, like as a baseline, and I'm sure you'll agree, like police should not be allowed to carry any weaponry that is illegal for a private citizen to carry.
Mm-hmm.
I believe personally that I don't think like a beat cop, like if we even have like what I would call like a surveillance cop that's just walking around looking for crimes to stop or whatever, like the traditional idea of a beat cop, that guy doesn't need to carry a gun. Like if you really need a gun, if you really need that kind of violent force, that should be like a SWAT team that's approved by a judge that goes through some sort of vetting process. Maybe as a bare minimum, like if you're going to take a gun to deal with the crime, you have to sign it out and write out why you're taking it. Like if you show up to a grocery store where someone passed a fake 20 and you have bear spray and a taser and an assault rifle strapped to your back, you should have to justify why you brought all that to deal with a very minor crime. And sort of shifting away from like, I felt scared and I had a gun in my pocket, so I shot him, to like making it more of a premeditated issue. Like it becomes very clear then which cops always take a gun with them, which cops always feel scared, always feel threatened, which cops are taking more weapons to deal with an Aboriginal person or a person of color than a white individual. Like these issues will become more clear as we put more of a paper trail there to follow. And I would also just say, like, sometimes you can just let people get away. Like if somebody's, like in a park bothering people, you don't necessarily have to kill that person in order to make sure that the law is enforced. Like you can stop at a point and say, this guy's dog pooped on the sidewalk, he's being disagreeable, we're not going to escalate it to the point of weaponry. We'll give up before then. And sometimes we can change to like that perspective where sometimes that's okay. Sometimes it's okay for police to say this isn't worth it. Like this is going in a bad direction and I'd rather just let this guy, come down and leave than to shoot him because he's being dangerous and disagreeable. Like,
yeah, I definitely agree with that last bit. This is something that I found interesting about Detroit threat management is that they have a recent policy where they don't carry guns.
Yeah.
And going along with what you're saying that the police should never carry anything the public can't, I believe the public should have the right to carry guns for self-defense. And I absolutely, if I were a cop and I was going into a violent neighborhood, even if I didn't know, like even if I was just doing a beat cop routine, like walking around the area, I would personally want a gun on me just in case. And I absolutely agree there's an issue with training where cops need to be trained to not use their weapon in these inappropriate situations when someone's just running away or someone's just and absolutely that's they need to use non-violent solutions or tasers or de-escalation or whatever else. But I personally think that I would be okay with Detroit threat management or cops in general for carrying guns, but I generally agree with what you're saying.
Do you think there are situations where it is inappropriate for a cop to have a weapon on them? Like not to like pull a weapon, but to be armed in the situation.
I'm not sure there is.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I'm like to say like the old like Chekhov's gun thing. Like if there's a gun in there and you start like there was what's the name of the guy who like stole the police officer's gun and then they shot
Yeah,
him? You
yeah,
know,
that's
I
a
can't
common
remember.
thing. Well, that's happens like a bunch. So
Yeah. So like
a
that's a
lot,
classic example where like that situation escalates because everyone shows up with weaponry. Whereas if like everyone showed up with billy clubs, you can still subdue somebody with billy clubs, but it's less. There's an inherent de-escalation when you show up without a gun. And as a cop, you're going to be more reserved. You're going to be more careful in your own application of force if you don't have like a gun that you have the right to just basically kill somebody with, whatever. Like,
yeah. I guess I see more value in that strategy in a society that doesn't have so many guns, I guess. Like,
for
for
sure.
instance, if you were in a community that didn't have a lot of guns, like Calgary doesn't have a lot of guns, it would make more sense for security firms to not necessarily carry that level of force. And that would make sense to me. But yeah, in lots of places, I can relate to a cop's perspective of better safe than sorry, and obviously that comes with the risk of somebody pulling your gun from you. And
For sure.
but that's just
I guess
I just think it's like a kind of a precaution thing. Like that's ultimately what the function of police best in their best form should be, is to guard against what could be, what horrible violence could take place. And I think if they don't have the ability to shut that down, then their whole function is kind of negated.
see, I would challenge you to say that I do not think it is the role of police to be preventative. Like police exist as an arm of justice to like deal with crime after the fact. I think there are always going to be rights violations and problems when you look at police as a preventative force. When you say as a cop you're out there trying to stop crimes from happening before they happen, then you're going to look more like when you tell a cop that, they start looking at everyone like they're a criminal, right? Like whereas if we said like you're not going to like you're not there to deal with people who might do something. You're there to like investigate a crime that's already happened, catch a guy after it happens. I think that's a better approach to crime. And I think that while perhaps you might see like the argument against that would be that it makes it easier for criminals, and it certainly does, and I acknowledge that. I think that it's impossible to prevent crime from happening. We've never successfully done it, and the only real result has been that people have less rights when it comes to dealing with police.
I would say that it's impossible to completely prevent crime from happening, but like I think there's always a case. There's always some degree to which we can. Also, what do you think about crimes in progress? Do you think police should be called to crimes? Like, say there's somebody like a bank robbery happening, or there's someone at my front door with an axe, and they're like slamming on my door and trying to rip open my door, and I call the police, and they're like, "Oh well, has the crime
Well,
happened yet?" And I'm like, "No, it hasn't happened yet." They're like, "Oh well, can't help you." What's your thought on that?
that's a more difficult situation. I think those situations are a lot more rare than people think they are. Like the idea of someone shows up to your house with a machine gun and like threatens to kill your whole family. Like certainly it does happen sometimes, but also again, like if you look at like domestic violence, for example, which is the most common example of what you're describing, police do a horrible job
Yeah,
dealing with it in every way. By every measurable metric, they're awful at it. And so maybe it would be better if we said like people are responsible for defending their own property. Like make it easier for someone to get a gun and defend their own front door, and then don't bring the police into that situation, because oftentimes they make it worse and they escalate the situation and it gets more dangerous.
I suppose one simple middle ground we could bring away from all this is maybe certain people could subscribe to police forces or private police that perform the function of prevention. Like if I say I wanted the right to call someone to protect me, maybe I'm an old lady, I'm worried about thugs in my neighborhood breaking in.
But I
I
guess
think if
like
I would want the right to be able to hire a police, my own personal version of police that would provide prevention.
don't you think like I guess we'll cycle back to this. Like we talked about this earlier, but like don't you think that when I am individually hiring like a bodyguard, for example, as opposed to a police officer, that there's a change in what I'm valuing in that relationship? Like if I hire private police, I don't want them to show up, carefully judge the situation and decide whether I need help. When I'm hiring a private cop, I want them to come and shoot the guy at my front door so that I'm safe. And again, the guy there that's supposedly perpetrating a crime against me isn't part of that negotiation, and his risk that he absorbs by me hiring private police. And perhaps this is like a pure microcosm of like corporations providing a dangerous service that only the people, like not everyone's getting a say in.
Well, I think if you're a member of a private police company, like you're an officer who's hired,
Yeah.
you're going to have a lot of very, very stringent regulations. And this is what they understand right now is that, or this is what we have right now is corporations that hire private police. Like if you're like this Detroit Threat Management and you hire a individual, you are very careful about what you promote in that company. You're very careful about what policies you put into place, and you make sure that they don't kill anyone unless that person is a clear threat. So I think the idea of with private police, you could just have an old lady be like, hey, come kill this black guy who's looking weird and hanging around with a hoodie around my property. I don't think that that's going to happen because people can't hide behind the power of the state to escape legal accountability. They're going to be
no legal accountability. Like talking about the extreme case where there isn't a state overseeing all of these things, like there is no legal accountability to a company like that because they are in the microcosm that they control. They are the law, or the surrogate for what now we think of as the law.
Well, this kind of gets into a broader context of like market law, but I don't at all think that these companies should exist in a microcosm. I think there's going to be the law of the society of which this company is going to be one player. And if they go around just ignoring the standards of society around when is violence appropriate, aka self-defense, defense of others, defense of property, if they ignore those standards and like overextend themselves, they're going to be viewed by the society in general, the majority, as another criminal, worthy of prosecution, worthy of defense against. And so I think that this could be a whole other discussion, the concept of market law, because it is a very big conversation. So maybe we shouldn't get too much into this.
We can stay away from it. I'm just curious.
But I absolutely agree. That is a big. I have not addressed your point. Is what I'm saying.
No, I appreciate that, but we don't have to get into a whole other thing.
Yeah.
How do you feel about so getting away from like police specifically? How do you feel about other arms of our current justice system, like lawyers, judges, perhaps legislators? Like, do you think that they are all tied into the same issue of police brutality, or do you think it really does seem to happen within police departments and kind of end there?
Yeah, well, I think legislators are complicit to the degree that they put in place systems like qualified immunity and protect cops and other individuals like that. I think lawyers are amazing. I think the part that lawyers will play in the progression of society is huge. I think they're like non-violent warriors who push forward legal precedents in positive directions, assuming they're fighting for the good and not the evil. But so I have a very positive view of lawyers. I don't think I can't really think of a context in which they currently support the systems that will prop up police brutality.
I'm going to share an experience that I had last year when I went to the annual Chamber of Commerce meeting.
Okay.
So they had a presentation, and essentially like the theme was like, why are laws so complicated? Like, why are there so many loopholes? Why is it so difficult for everyone to do their job? Why do we have a legal code that's thousands of pages long? And that is where lawyers have played a negative role. So as a microcosm, let's look at like family law, like divorces, child settlements, things like that. So like when the laws first came out, it was very simple, and it was basically like 50-50. You split things down the middle. It was a very uncomplicated law, which meant that there was not as much room for lawyers to make money because they were quick, easy trials. Whereas over time, we've built an immensely complicated and like if you know anyone who is divorced with children, like it is a lifelong legal battle that you are constantly having. They're always changing the rules. There's always new things to fight about. And lawyers clean up and make millions of dollars off of what could be a very simple agreement. And you see that everywhere. In criminal law, it's the same thing. Like if you're a defense attorney, forgetting about your client, like as a defense attorney, what benefits you is having complicated laws that only you understand, that are very difficult and inaccessible for everyday people.
I can see that absolutely. The complexity of law equals profit for lawyers. I never thought about that. That's a really good point.
And in the same talk, they talked about accounting and taxes, and it's the same thing. That like as an accountant, the whole just calculate how much money you made and multiply it by 12% is, there's no money in that for an accountant. Whereas an immensely complicated tax structure that has thousands of obscure deductions and things like that, you can make a lot of money as an accountant. So they are the people every year that lobby for 100 little amendments to the rules. And it really opened my mind, because it's not something like, until you really think about it, you'd never think about it, but then it makes sense as soon as you hear it.
No, absolutely. I that's a good point. Damn.
I know. No, like noodle on it for a little bit, but it's like, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, like I used to think the same thing. Like, oh, my accountant, he's a good guy. Like he's defending me against the government. Like he's got my back. And then you hear something like that, and you're like, wow, like certainly in the short term he helps me, and so does my lawyer. But in the long term, they want you to have to spend more money on their services, right?
Yeah.
Like
on an individual basis, they're probably helping you, but they're part of a general structure and a part of an interest group that promotes things that harm your interests, for sure.
Yeah. Well, similar to government itself, it is in their best interest to make you more dependent upon them and their services.
Yeah, for sure.
And therefore willing to pay more in exchange for those things. And so like they work on that same sort of metric, which is kind of an interesting idea. Because like, you know, you hear lots of people, like that's a big question I have with our legal system is why is it like this? Like, why are there so many rules? Why is it so complicated?
It's awful.
Like, especially with corporate law, because of course there's more money in corporate lawyers than in like criminal defense lawyers.
Yeah.
Like, it's just exceedingly complicated of like, why is this company allowed to pollute and this one isn't? Why is Coca-Cola allowed to grow cocaine, but nobody else in the country can? Like, it's just, you know, and there's billions of dollars were made making it complicated.
Yeah, no, it makes sense.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that they all have a role in it. Judges, I think in Canada, we have a pretty good judicial system. And maybe I don't know enough about it to really like know what the major problems are, but I think our judges are pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough either, but
yeah.
Yeah, I should probably get going pretty soon here, but do you have any like final thoughts on the issue of?
I would just question, I guess my summary is it perhaps worth it to trade a little bit of theoretical freedom in order to gain a lot of practical freedom? Is it better to, like, my counterpoint to the libertarian argument of like everything should be freely entered into is that if we can give up a little bit of theoretical freedom and give the government a little bit of like non-consensual control of our life, and in return that gets us a lot of practical freedom and liberty in terms of the day-to-day things that we're going to do, is that a deal we should consider making?
Yeah, if I may just quickly, not to claim the last word, but maybe the counter to that would be, is it worth it to, in order to be guaranteed this basic amount of freedom, assuming it is guaranteed for lower income and minorities?
For sure, and that is a question that bears discussing, is whether we actually get any freedom.
So is that guarantee worth the danger of that wedge that we discussed? That's the undermining of the basic human rights that could like just a little bit get in there.
I like the imagery of the wedge because everyone hates the slippery slope. So you just like
yeah, well, it's like, you know, like a little hole in the dam, one little crack in the dam, whatever you want.
No, for sure, and I think it's valid, and especially it is historically valid. And libertarians don't get a lot of historically valid arguments, but that one is historically valid.
Cool. Well, I think that's like a great. I don't know. I think your position is like, you know, it's a shame you're not more off the deep end where. You have it's very grounded, and like I think we're very close.
I think the real solution is like a 12% increase to municipal funding of police. That will solve all of the
problems. Perfect.
That's what I advocate for.
Yeah, I thought that was a good discussion.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed.
Do you want to talk about market law? That's not even something that I've like. That's not a term I'm familiar with.
Well, maybe I'll do like a, yeah, eventually I do want to.
Yeah.
Not this video, but
No, no, I meant like next time.
sure. But let's do like an official, like, goodbye, everybody. Thank
Yeah.
you for
Tune in next time.
watching this video.
Yeah.